We arrive in the 1990s, where denial faded into apathy and will forge anger. As I touched on previously, apathy is a brief, intermittent mini-stage between denial and anger. Apathy was at its height in the early 90s, perfectly embodied by grunge. I'm on a plane, and I can't complain. Grunge had a complete, uncaring attitude, even down to the lyrics, which seemed nonsensical at times. There was a sense at the time that we had reached nirvana, that people had reached the enlightened state of not caring. There was a sense of reaching the peak and thinking, this is it? This is most revealed in the ironic humor of the time.
Yeah. I'm betting he's gonna swear first.
The deadpan snark of the likes of Bill Murray and George Carlin was at its height, and stand-up comedy was at its peak. This ties into the stereotype of the jaded Gen Xer, and why many people grew tired of the pompous and fake glam aesthetic of the 80s, embracing a new look that was more messy and realistic. The most famous album at the time is even called Nevermind, which perfectly showcases how prevalent apathy was. In the video game sphere, while things are still primitive in the 90s, we do see the beginnings of a new type of video game protagonist. Unlike the humble, innocent fantasy characters of the 80s, like Mario and Zelda, the 90s heroes were snarky and edgy, more like cartoon show characters of the time than their wholesome Nintendo counterparts. Sonic the Hedgehog, Spyro the Dragon, and Crash Bandicoot are some examples. Interesting to note that Nintendo has stuck by their denial era image, making it their brand. Sega crashed and burned once the 90s were over, and PlayStation adapted to the bargaining era perfectly. Also, video games shifted their focus from fantastical settings to more realistic ones. Even games with fantasy locations often included mechanical dungeons and metallic laboratories. In the 90s, we see the beginning of video games as a medium, becoming about story just as much as about gameplay, and being more grounded in realism as opposed to just abstract pixels and sound effects. Games become about accomplishing a goal rather than getting a high score, becoming less about being a gimmicky novelty that you put quarters into, and more about an engaging experience that you can enjoy at home alone, as consoles and PCs become the norm. What does this have to do with anger, you might ask? Unlike in the shock and denial, where there is some comfort in doing nothing, in anger, one wants to accomplish something. There is no satisfaction until a task is complete, which can alleviate that anger. Shock is like dangling keys. It's a distraction, an attention grabber. Denial is procrastination, or pretending no tasks or problems actually exist. Anger is a drive to get something done. An example would be in the movie Braveheart. William Wallace starts off relatively carefree, but eventually he cannot deny his problems anymore. His wife having been killed, he gets revenge on her murderer, treating him to the same fate. It is in this moment where you see him seethe. Here his apathy has completely vanished, and a blistering rage erupts, which he holds on to until the end of the film, where he actually accomplishes his goal. Now, you could argue Wallace goes through all the stages and gets to acceptance at the end. This is true, but Wallace is still angry for the majority of the movie, and it is still clearly a work of the anger era. Anger is about being driven, far beyond driven, if you will. Pantera defines metal in the 90s.
The releasing of anger, combating any medicine under the sun.
Far too angry for the 80s or the early 2000s, venting frustrations in a way that few other bands can replicate. The perfect embodiment of the anger era of music, equipped with lyrics about social commentary and personal struggles that outside of the anger era are largely left untouched. In general, music in the 90s distanced itself from the cheesy ballads and corny tunes of the 80s new wave, power metal, and synth pop, and moved towards the more gritty punk rock, gangster rap, industrial, and nu metal. I should also mention that this is why bands are known for having a 7-year itch, or better put, a band's popularity lasts about 7 years. This is because after 7 years, one stage has evolved into another, so either the band has to change their sound to adapt, or they become stale and become an artifact of their time. Take Marilyn Manson. Their first album, Antichrist Superstar, is a work of pure anger, but his following albums included bargaining elements, and later lost relevancy. In 2015, Marilyn Manson made a comeback with their album The Pale Emperor. Why was this considered a comeback album? I would argue it's because it's a work of art of the Depression stage, a clear distinction from the anger and bargaining themes of the former albums. Metallica began as a shock and denial band with their album Kill 'Em All, but evolved gradually into a denial and anger band with the Black Album. However, they were unable to evolve into the bargaining or depression stage, indicated well by their 2003 album Saint Anger, which is their most hated album. Metallica's sound is stuck in the 80s and 90s, up to and including their most recent material, and they just made it into their brand. Their most famous song also captures denial becoming anger. Exit light, enter night. Heavy thoughts tonight, and the yawn of Snow White. The dreamlike 80s has faded into a nightmare that one wishes to wake up from. The 90s is waking up. The presence of the devil has become too real to ignore anymore, sparking anger to fight for or against the devil. A film that demonstrates this well is The Truman Show. It may seem like an odd choice, as Truman is hardly an angry character, but it's a great example of the dreamlike environment becoming so mundane it causes apathy, and then so unnatural and wrong that it incites a course of anger that keeps one persistent until the end. Truman starts off just bored, but then becomes driven to wake up and see reality for how it really is, instead of living in denial. For most of the film, he gets nowhere, and his frustration grows, until the final moment. Much like Sarah from Labyrinth, Truman also refuses to deal with the devil. Instead, he responds to the director's offer by being snarky and saying his catchphrase sarcastically before stepping off stage and entering into the real world. Unlike Labyrinth, however, the Truman Show's ending is bittersweet. While you can be happy for Truman, he also lived his whole life believing a lie. How well is Truman gonna fare out in the real world? The director even tells him that the real world is just as fake, and there's some truth to that. If the theme of the 70s was, wow, things are changing, and the theme of the 80s was, nothing more should change, then the theme of the 90s was, things need to change. Unfortunately, this leads to the I can change things of the early 2000s, where the deal with the devil takes place, and the I can't change anything of the 2010s. Hopefully the 2020s will be I can adapt to change. I will discuss one more film that taps into the mini stage between anger and bargaining. This stage is called Dread or Angst. Dread, in many ways, is a second disbelief, where you realize the devil really means business, and you cannot return to denial this time. The terror induced by this leads many to plead and bargain their way out of an impending doom. The Matrix is the dreamlike state. If you take the blue pill, you return to denial, but if you take the red pill, you venture into reality and see how deep the rabbit hole goes. In the film The Matrix, both Neo and Cypher take the red pill, but Cypher can't handle it, so he makes a pact with the Smiths, the architects of the pseudo-reality. Since Cypher cannot take the blue pill now, it's his only option to return to blissful ignorance. This Faustian bargain ends up backfiring and getting Cypher killed, whereas Neo rises to the challenge in spite of the red pill, essentially becoming a god. The 90s were a time of stagnation and frustration. Mundane materialism entrapped people. It is not until we have lost everything that we are truly free. Tyler Durden. However, not everyone can become a god, and not everyone can handle the red pill. In the next installment, I will finally tackle the deal with the devil, and the idea of playing God that is the subject matter of the bargaining era of the early 2000s. And in case I don't see ya, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.